Good afternoon. This is the last talk of the main agenda before I hand over to our closing keynote. I'm going to try to take the level down a little technically, but at the same time make sure everyone's awake. And I'm now paranoid about stepping into the green area, so apologies if I wander back into the wind tunnel. My name's Andrew Stewart. I work at LMAX Exchange, where I kind of herd data, I think is probably the best job description I could come up with for myself. LMAX probably isn't huge news in the States, somewhat bigger in Europe. We're a foreign currency trading exchange. So the system Matt and Lee showed you earlier, we're at the back end of something like that, trying desperately to generate the kind of message rates and data that causes their UIs to choke. And today, what I'd like to do is spend a little time looking at what's behind that, what makes that interesting as a reactive problem, what makes that interesting as a technology challenge. And so the data's big, but it's not only big. It's complicated, and it's fast-moving. First, though, just to show you how new and fresh this material is, I want to take a little trip back, just 5 weeks, 15th of October, 2014. Anyone remember anything important happening that day? Well, happy that it was a big day for us as well. No, 10-year anniversary. I'm actually now really feeling cheap about what I'm going to claim here.
And I remembered it.
And he remembered it. 10-year anniversary and still married. Good. Well, 15th of October, there's a few other notable events. It had been a busy month in foreign exchange. Volumes had been picking up through September and October generally. But on the 15th, certainly at LMAX, we saw our biggest day in trading history by a pretty comfortable margin. It was about a 30% lift on anything we'd ever had before. So what happened at the 15th? If you hit the news sites, if you go to various random, that day in history and pictures sites, you'll see some interesting stuff. So Rosetta Satellite, this was the interception with the comet, which name I can't remember, 3 letters. So European Space Agency's Rosetta Satellite, I think, basically closed the best selfie ever competition with this little number here. Hurricane Gonzalo, closing in on Bermuda. It got upgraded to Category 4 that day. This was the biggest hurricane in about 3 years in the North Atlantic. Wasn't that? We had cultural icons sighted on the streets of Europe in both planned and unplanned visits, and it really wasn't that excited the news. Anyone recognize this? No, any Maryland residents here? Okay, this is the headquarters of the US Census Bureau. This is not some kind of East Coast dark pool or some New Jersey data center where a weird hedge fund is doing something that's destabilizing the global economy. This is the traditionally more staid and steady US Census Bureau, and they released some news. And the news was that month-on-month retail sales had gone down in the US. I'm not saying that the citizens of the United States had stopped buying stuff. They had not given up commerce altogether and reverted to a system of barter and exchange. No, they'd simply bought about just slightly less than 1/3 of 1% less stuff in September than they bought the month before. That set the world, at least the foreign exchange currency world, alight. So to put this in context, that 1.3% is about, that 1/3% is about $1.3 billion. We traded more than 10 times that on the back of this event, purely on people speculating what did that drop mean for the dollar or yen or euro, and basically any currency that was traded heavily against dollar. People just betting on what that meant traded 10 times more than the event itself. And what that meant to us was that in 15 minutes after that announcement, on one of our exchanges, and we run 3 of these, but hand on heart, this is the biggest of them, we received 11 million. Sorry, I just poked my mic. We received 11 million orders to buy or sell a currency. Most of these are speculative. They don't actually result in an actual trade. There's someone punting a number in at where they believe the price is to see if anyone else will bite. Those 11 million orders comprised 150 million price points. So that's an individual offer for a certain currency at a certain price, buy or sell. In response to that, we pushed out to our assorted clients well over 1 billion price events. And the scale up here is because certain clients can receive data at certain rates and certain clients are only interested in certain products. But we pushed out about 1 billion messages out the door in that 15 minutes to the various clients who were interested in seeing what was happening and maybe making a bid. In response to all of this work, and this is exactly the sort of thing we were seeing behind the UIs earlier, our clients very generously generated an entire 37,000 tradable orders. This is what pays our bills compared to that which is what actually drives our costs. Now, those are the sort of ratios that, if this is the VC pitch, you're rapidly going to get shut down. This is, you know what, let's find an easier way of making money on the internet. It's not going to work this way. However, what it does do is it generates some interesting technology problems and it generates some interesting data problems. And what I'd like to answer today are a few important questions. So first of all, given that kind of challenge, given the fact that we have to react to those sort of unpredictable news events, and no one typically knows, we know when those news events are coming, but no one knows whether they're going to be a kind of a monumental thing, or as retail sells is normally a kind of, market doesn't care, move on. So, how do we actually do it? Having done it, how do we measure that we're doing it? How do we actually get confidence in the fact that we're doing what we think we're doing? And once we've done it, how do we go back and investigate what happened? And how do we actually look at history? So that's what I'd like to address today. What I'd like to also address is the fact that those questions are in almost precisely the wrong order, if you want to build a good system. Finally, I'd like to answer this one first, just to put in the context of what's unique about running a financial exchange that makes those questions particularly interesting. So, it's the end of 2 reasonably draining days, so I'm going to insist on some sort of movement, just if anything to get some blood moving. Failing that, to find out you're awake. I want a quick audience poll, and I don't want that sort of, come on, arms up. So when I say financial trading exchange, just get a mental picture. Form the first thing that comes into your mind. This is one little psych test. Hang on to that. And then there are no right or wrong answers here. There are also no prizes. Show of hands if your picture's anything like this. Okay, so that's the history crowd. This is the traditional view of a financial exchange. Certainly what they used to look like. That's the New York Stock Exchange, open outcry, bits of paper, trades made and done, and all over in a flurry of torn paper on the floor at the end of the day. Okay, again, show of hands, anything like this. Yeah, so this is a little more up to date. This is the humming, glowing data center, the rush of the fan, which I'm kind of feeling a little closer to now. The air conditioning going, the machines blinking and flashing, and everything going on high tech. No more expensive traders on the desks or even on the trading floors. The machines are just humming to each other and dealing with the world. Anyone have something like that? No, that's even more topical. This is what happens when trading goes wrong and banks get fined, good $4 billion for rigging Forex. Anyone have anything like that? No, okay, so this, if you run a financial market, if you run a trading exchange, this is what you think of every day. Because what we have is actually a complicated ecosystem. For our clients, getting data to them, it's really a case of better never than late. There is no point sending you a price that's 5 seconds old. It's gone, it's moved already. If you make decisions on that price, you will get burned. We need to understand that all our clients are acting and getting and receiving data at a fair rate so they can compete reasonably with each other. And in our sort of ecosystem terms, I basically need to make sure the lions don't eat all the elephants don't eat all the vegetations, and most importantly, no paying tourists get trampled to death. It's trying to keep this thing alive. It is basically, financial trading is a zero-sum game. We don't create any real value. It's money ebbing and flowing backwards and forwards between the different participants, and we need a very tight view on what's going on there. We need a very deep understanding of both the actual business data, the transactions that are being done, and the measurements around that, to be able to manage that exchange. Otherwise, what happens is we have a very brief, exciting life as a business, and then we go out of business. So, first question I hope to answer is how do we actually do that? How do we run a system that runs at these kind of transaction rates? If you are trading, if you want that ecosystem to survive, one of the things most people rely on is very, very predictable performance. We need to be consistent and reliable in how long it takes you to perform a transaction. And generally, the sort of figures we're talking about, FX is a little weird. We're not at that kind of race to the zero that you'd see on the equities exchanges. Most foreign exchange has been traded. It's emerging almost from a phone trading model to a peer-to-peer model. We're one of the first true exchanges trading it. And we are aiming at, for our most exacting clients, maybe 200 microseconds, typical experience. And I'll show you some statistics that show where we are. And we want the 4 nines, so 1 in 10,000 of those instructions to be no worse than about 4 milliseconds. And we need to do that consistently, reliably all day, regardless of whether we have this 11 million order spike or whether we've actually just got a quiet morning because Japan hasn't woken up yet. And a lot of the thought that the next section of this talk really goes back to a question someone asked me in an interview. So we're going through the standard, tell me about your company, tell me about your background, a little bit about what you do here at LMAX, yada, yada, yada. And the question came up, which is the first time it occurred to me that this was a really unnatural question because I hadn't heard it in a while, and I kind of got embedded into the way we build technology, which was, so where do you keep your data? And sort of thought for a while, and I think the guy was expecting the kind of, we have it all in Cassandra, or we're Mongo, or whatever. Some kind of answer like that, and the answer he got was, well, it's complicated. And I think that the curse, or what was in his head still, does anyone remember pictures like this? The lovely kind of enterprise architecture model, layers, layers, layers. Somewhere at the bottom there'd be this data layer where you looked after all the data, and we just don't build applications like that anymore. The idea of where do you keep your data doesn't really work for me anymore. Instead, the way I like to think about the data is actually as a kind of generational problem. We have a life cycle, and at different points in the life cycle of the data, it's important for it to have certain different features. The very beginning of that life cycle is for us conception. And this is an appropriate analogy. For us, the vast majority of initial events result in absolutely nothing. Yeah, nothing is born, nothing is conceived, nothing goes through to any kind of maturity. It's just a flash in the pan, a brief, furious period of activity, and then zap, that's it. End of any active life as a transaction. Has a very interesting future life as metrics, as an observation of our system, but not as a real business transaction. This early stage is where we have the most aggressive kind of reactive characteristics of the system. This is the core of the trading system. We're dealing with a small working set of data. I say small, hundreds of thousands to millions of data points. Nothing you can't really worry about holding in memory, but with these highly aggressive response time characteristics. And it needs to be resilient, and it needs to scale when the demands go up. It's also highly contended. We run, there just aren't that many currencies. In terms of currencies we offer, when you look at the various traded pairs, we offer about 100, and most of our trading is on the top 10 of those. Euro dollar, pound dollar, Euro JPY, dollar Swiss. Currency trading is a very, very contended area. There's an awful lot of focus on trading in a small number of products. And we just cannot let this thing go down. For most of our clients, when they trade with us, the only way they can actually manage their losses or lock in their profits is to trade with us again. And that's not true for all foreign exchange trading, but that is for the model we offer our customers. And the model that is normal in retail, you trade with your own broker, and the way you trade out is, again, with your own broker. So this is a system that we have a fairly intensive requirement on in terms of offering customers a consistent service. And the only way I can really do that is if I don't have to worry about where I go to get the data. The data's already there when I actually receive the instructions. So how do I build one of these? the sort of model we have for these very high performance pieces of our architecture is around, we receive an instruction. It comes in from a set of gateway machines, and the sort of boundaries of either a process, typically the machine boundaries we're talking about are the blue line here. They're the point at which I receive an instruction and I can sequence it. I can do something to it. I can actually apply my application logic to that instruction. I can match the order with another order, or I can check whether the customer's got enough money to place that order, reject it if it's too risky, reject it if there's some kind of suspension on the market and we've closed it. And most importantly, I can deal with durability. I can deal with being applying a durable transaction, but I can also deal with resiliency by pushing that message off somewhere for whatever my high availability solution is. And in our case, we do this through replication. So for each of those blue dashed boxes, I've got another copy listening to that stream of messages coming out and applying them into its own application logic in exactly the same deterministic pattern. And then we publish them out the back. So we run our event, publish the result of that, and multiple subscribers listen to those outcomes. So to answer the question this guy gave me in an interview of, well, where's your data? The data's only there. It's not a case of, oh, well, we store it in X. The data is in the application. And this isn't a case of, oh, this is a cache or a memory view or a transient view. The only place our core business data exists is in the running application. You turn it off, it's not there anymore. Now, obviously, that's not a particularly viable long-term solution. Yes, we persist it for recovery, and we have a transaction log. If you look into the, what's inside that durability box there, you'd see something that looks an awful lot like a database. It's a series of transactions, and every so often we snapshot what's going on, really just to speed up recovery so I don't have to replay every event in the instruction log since 2007. Wouldn't give us a very good recovery time. But basically that is our data model. It's not just a case of in memory, it's in memory, in process, and in memory structures that we care very, very deeply about. So the sort of tuning patterns that I was used to as a database person 10 years ago, where I'm worried about, well, I've got a cache miss from the buffer cache and I've got to go to disk, are replayed here in the micro version. I'm now worried actually about having an L2 cache miss and having to go to main memory, because that's going to slow me down. I'm worried about operating system stalls. I'm worried about garbage collection stalls. I'm even worried now that the last thing we had to rewrite in this model, which we were looking at earlier this year, was in the journaling, where we write that transaction log to disk, and we had to worry about the buffer cache implementation on Linux, because that actually wasn't giving us enough consistency. So we played around with direct writes, so bypassed the buffer cache completely to unreliable. Use the buffer cache, we were still getting latency spikes. You get into points where basically the data structure inside the buffer cache goes into you had too many writes, you've written too many events, and it goes into a structural reorganization, and again we get spikes. So the last point we did here was effectively write our own buffer cache implementation using memory map files. Now, if I want to put a few of those together, I need a way of communicating. And pretty much the way we string these things together is I have any one of those, as well, once it's received its event and is about to publish it, it offers one contract, and its one contract is that it will be able to republish that message. So it basically puts it into some kind of buffer where it can replay messages on demand, and the subscriber's contract is that it will check the things it receives. It will look for sequenced messages, it will detect gaps, it will ignore duplicates, and then it will do its own application logic and look after its own durability and HA and DR as required. So really the concept of there being a data layer, a database where we stick everything, and that's kind of, that's the permanent, consistent view, has gone away. Each component in that mesh that we put together is responsible for its own persistence, responsible for managing its own data. And that works to a level. There are some major limitations with this as a general purpose system. The first is that if I have a system that has to reliably process instructions in around 100 microseconds, I cannot, by definition, ask it to do anything that takes significantly more than 100 microseconds, unless I want to blow my 4 nines. And there's no way I can stick something into that queue and expect that to, if the expected runtime of that question is a few milliseconds, I'm never going to meet my service levels. Because we run all of this application logic single-threaded. That's a whole different presentation, a whole different topic, and probably one Martin has covered numerous times better than I will. But I'm stuck really with a model I can only ask quick questions of. I can't ask it the long-running, complicated questions, and to a degree, I'm constrained on physical memory. There's only so much data I can store. I cannot have unbounded history in here. So we move on to the next generation of data. After that short birth and, well, short attempt at birth, possibly birth into a real transaction, we have the long-term version of data, which for us is really, it's a terminal event. Once we've actually made a transaction, made a trade, decided the two customers have been matched and told both of them about it, that's kind of it. We're never going to go back and change that. And I was thrilled really to hear, twice today the fact that update is dead. And this is an argument I've been having with development teams for about the past, 5 to 10 years. If I am going to go to the bother of sticking this stuff on disk somewhere, I don't want to go back and write it again. I'm doing this when it's finished. I'm interested in it later for analytical purposes, for management information, for reporting, for all the usual accounting and financial operations, but I'm not going to change it again. The thing happened. So for us, data is very much either very briefly alive with a short lifetime or dead. And when it's dead, we're still going to look at it, but it's not going to change. Dead data for us is really anything with an arbitrary history. It's never going to change again. We're still dealing with data at a very exact kind of model. I'm still dealing with things I understand. And when I say exact, I mean sort of exact like building a bridge, as opposed to exact like predicting weather. There's no uncertainty here. These are financial numbers, how much money is in your account, what profit did you make, what commission have we recovered from that. However, it's still quite structured. We don't really leap off into the unknown too much here. I know broadly how people are going to access this data. Typically, as the history gets bigger, the kind of analyses become more and more aggregated. I'm looking at annual statements, summaries, customer segments, rather than individual trades and transactions. And most importantly, it's append-only. And I say your mileage may vary there. I do have this argument with development teams on a regular basis of I truly believe you can do a lot with traditional SQL databases. And under here, we just run MySQL for this kind of data. You can do a lot if you never update, never delete. Just insert everything. And I don't just mean insert transactions. If reference data changes, the old data was still valid. That existed for a while. Insert that. Just version the whole lot. And the argument I normally have, or the argument I normally receive about this, is this added complexity, and we don't need to deal with that. No, versioning's hard, and how do I know what the latest version is, what's current? Once you've done it once, it's really not that difficult. There is resistance to this. I respect their right to be wrong about it, but I would generally say version everything. It really is. It works well in append-only mode. How do we build one of those? So we saw this earlier. This is my generic model for how we build applications. To get stuff into a database, all I do is build a special version of one of those subscribers, which is an archiver. So now my data, I could answer the guy a little more realistically in terms of his expectations of an answer of, where's your data? Yet some of it does end up in a traditional SQL database. And that works for us for the structured stuff. We've taken it out of line. That write is happening milliseconds to seconds after the event has happened. It's all post-fact. There's no time pressure on this. The data will just find its way down there as and when it's necessary. And we can ask those long-running, awkward, predictable questions. We can stream fairly easily hundreds of thousands to millions of rows a second in there, but not with anything like the kind of predictable latency I can do in our high-volume systems. So I'm kind of happy with the data in there. I'm happy that I can ask the long-running questions, but I'm never going to do anything that requires the kind of transaction time responses we want with a database at the end of it. And that was kind of as far as the conversation got, and I didn't think about it again. This was a couple of years ago, really until I was asked to do the first version of this presentation in April in London, and realised that actually covered just a tiny portion of the scope of the data we have to look after. yes, it's actually the guts of what you think about when you build a trade, when you're building a trading system. I've got my orders and they're going to match each other, and I have to record trades and I have to record all the financial transactions about that. And I have to have my, whatever it is, 7 years history of all my actions with the customer to meet my regulatory requirements. But it's really the tip of the iceberg. And there's this stuff that just keeps refusing to fit into this nice kind of generational working set, fast, history, bit slower, ancient history, even more aggregated and probably even slower kind of hierarchy. It just doesn't fit. And it's the sort of data you need when you're asking questions about how you actually measure what you're doing. Yeah? It's what I would broadly classify not as big data necessarily, but as difficult data. I mean, the volumes can be big, often huge, but it's the stuff that's tricky to deal with. The structure is there, but it's looser and it develops. We are now out of building bridges and into predicting weather. If the volumes are big enough that I can't actually be accurate about it, I'm making inferences. I'm having to deal with the horrors of statistics. The search keys are far less predictable. I may be very interested in a single customer in the same way that I am in the trading system. I'm as likely to be interested in what messages are coming from a specific router in our system. Who's using what firewall, what IP address are you coming from? I just don't know. And this model mutates and evolves rapidly. It really is hurting all the pain points that the NoSQL crowd will point to relational databases and laugh about. This is the data that makes them do that, at least in my opinion. So a typical example of that is the time series data. Stuff we measure to measure how well we're performing. Gauges and metrics. Numbers we want to observe. Volumes that can very, very rapidly be utterly overwhelming. And volumes that are they're problematic to deal with. And let me go into that last point in a little more detail. This is actually from one of our live systems. This is another event. This is not the US Census Bureau messing with us. This is NonFarm Payroll, another exciting publication. This is more reliably volatility causing. This is when on the first Friday of every month, another US government bureau, I forget which one, announces the pay statistics for that month for a certain sector of the US workforce, basically everyone who's not in farms. And again, the world tends to go a little bit nuts because it's a big economic indicator of what's going on. What people have been paid is important to what they will do, and the usual ramp of speculation goes. And you can see there, possibly not read the numbers, it's at about 2:30 GMT in the middle of the chart there. This is the number of messages per second we're receiving at the front, the internet-facing servers, our front gateways, and it just doubles. As that announcement happens and people suddenly start speculating and trading on whether that announcement is good or bad for dollar or euro or pound. And we'll see that pretty regularly every month, and again less regularly on less expected events. But everyone happy there with what I mean by messages per second? Yeah? No? You really shouldn't be. That messages per second is a fabulous way to lie, because what the hell does messages per second actually mean? And this is the problem with time series. It's working out how much data is actually enough to say something useful. So, this is, that was actually a day of data measured at the minute level. Now, so I've got about 1500, 1440, we shut for 5 minutes, so 1435 observations taken at minute granularity of the number of messages per second. But what does messages per second at minute granularity mean? I'm instantly introducing some kind of statistical model to convert a minute to a second. And in this case, that was just averaging. That was counting the number of messages in a given second, in a given minute, dividing by 60. Well, that's my message per second rate, because that's what we get measured on in terms of the technology team and what they're meant to provide for business. We're asked for a certain number of messages per second. And measured at the minute rate, it's actually not too challenging. 5,000 peak. Meh. That's not hard. As you increase the granularity of measurement, you start to actually see the truth. So I'd actually like to measure per second, and given I've only got 1,500 points to plot, I've got to pick one of those seconds, and I can go into averages, I could look at the mode, I could look at the mean. We've actually picked the peak here to look at what's going on in a second. So if I pick the peak second in a minute, we've kind of doubled. We've gone from 5 to between 8 and 10,000 messages per second. So that's measuring the peak second and inferring from that what the number for the whole minute. If you look at the peak 100 milliseconds, so the peak tenth of a second, you're up again, and you can imagine how the pattern evolves. It goes nuts. When we're down to measuring the peak millisecond, we've gone from 5,000 to 250,000 as the spike events. That's utterly unlike anything you would get measuring and averaging over any period of time. To see that level of detail, you need to count every event going through and record it. And this is the challenge of turning something into a convenient time series. I need to capture the data, and I need a way of visualizing it. Because actually, I cannot plot. If I actually measured every millisecond, I cannot plot, 84 million data points in any sort of useful way. I need to do something with that data to actually plot both the time series for visualization, but also understand within the time series that I can actually display and understand as a human being what was going on at those time points. And peak is a very rough way of doing it. Generally, what we would do is look at multiple different data points that try and give us some kind of characterization. A little bit like a histogram per time point. And if anyone out there has got a good way of actually measuring or visualizing time series histograms, talk to me, I'd love to see it. But what that means is I can take something like this, I can take my original time series, where I'm just arbitrarily counting message per second. This actually is peak on a 5-second interval. And I can start augmenting it with other series. And Gil would be proud of me. I am not counting mean latency there. That's the red line is our 99 percentile. The blue line is the 4 nines. So we're running what? At about 99% under a millisecond, and spikes up. Yeah, we broke our SLA. We went over 4 twice in that event. So I can start recording multiple time series, and that's an improvement. It's definitely a step forward. But it's still a lie. Yeah, that is not the truth. At this point, at this resolution, and I've got an idea of, how much of my data am I just throwing away? Rough guess? Almost all of it. It's over 99.98% of my data if I'm measuring a minute event and the peak millisecond is being thrown away. And even here, where we're measuring slightly finer, we're capturing a tiny number of the actual data points. And if I sifted through all of these different sampling mechanisms, I would still not find this pattern, which is actually what's going on. And I'll zoom into that. This is the anatomy of a second on our system. Yeah, it's actually that's slightly improved. That is the anatomy of about 10 hours, so about 350,000 seconds overlaid on each other. Counting the milliseconds into it. And if I zoom in there, the different colors are our major customers. The spike, the y-axis there is the message rate, so how many messages we received from that customer in that second. And these patterns are actually echoes of other systems in the financial markets. That very, very pronounced 250 millisecond spike, that's Reuters. That's when they publish their market data, 4 times a second. The lower key, 100 millisecond spike, that's EBS. Again, another major currency platform. They publish 10 times a second, and we see the market responding to those. We're very much, I'd like to claim we're a primary market and that we influence the world. We're not there yet, if I'm realistic. Give it a year. So, and the even smaller peaks, that's actually EBS across the pond. So we're seeing the transatlantic latency echoed in this data. I am not going to see this with any kind of sampling mechanism. And my physics is too out of date to remember how to do fast Fourier analysis on a data stream coming through this fast. I actually need low-level, individual message data to be able to pick up on this kind of pattern. And this pattern is massively important to us. First of all, because when we're load testing the system, if I'm going to actually test our system for latency and understand how it behaves, I need to replicate that kind of behavior, because one of the things this tells me is that my loads are going to be massively peaky. And if I miss the fact that this is what's coming in, I could very easily test a system that told me it was giving me adequate performance because it was managing to amortize all that load over a much flatter profile. Now, this is why we see in those early numbers that actually, even though we were only processing a notional 10,000 orders a second, we were receiving in excess of 250,000 orders per second measured at the millisecond grain. The other thing this sort of thing is incredibly important to do is some, what would seem like very blasé design decisions. So we have a requirement, let's say, to disconnect if a client is placing orders into our system and they lose connection. Yeah, we notice that they are no longer heart beating, or we've had a TCP disconnect, they've torn down the session. We have to get them out of the market. They're no longer in control of their orders. Prices are moving fast enough that if they leave those orders in there, they may be trading at very bad prices, and we can't let that happen. And that's not unique to us by any means. I'm not claiming that that's an added challenge for us. But the sort of naive implementation of that is, well, the customer would normally measure that time out in tenths of seconds or milliseconds. You put in something that is a scheduled job to look for them, or a timed event, and you think, well, yeah, millisecond timing, that's fine. So the sort of default, not even brain dead, but the just standard programming practices, not thinking about it, you'll tend to align system events on neat little millisecond boundaries, just when we're absolutely the busiest internally, because we didn't see this data. So we absolutely talk about quiet times in the day, but the quiet times in the day for us are sort of between 30 and 45 milliseconds into each 50 millisecond period. And we kind of like to align things on those if we can to get better use of the system, because there's nothing else going on. No one's pricing. There's a few of the banks who price really slowly, or price maybe from an American feed who are doing stuff, but this is gold to us in terms of planning and scheduling work. I'm never going to see that unless either I know to look for it, I have better physics than I care to remember, or I have the low-level transaction data, the low-level event log that I can then play with and look for patterns and look for things that are interesting. Basically, pan this stuff for gold. So, given that, how do we actually investigate what's going on? Got an idea of how we measure it. The other big problem we have is looking at stuff that's happened in the past. And this broadly falls into two problem areas for us. One is that the kind of audit trail and message logging. The other is what was loosely described as forensics. I will dismiss auditing fairly quickly because actually I think it's a fixed problem. If you were versioning everything, you wouldn't need to audit anyway, but I'll get off that soapbox. The other is, if the document database people have done nothing else, and history will tell, they have rehabilitated audit and message logging. They have taken the bit of software development that always got, end of the story, got to write the auditing bit, which was really tedious and dull and a bit of a tax on developing any new feature, and made it cool, because you get to play with a shiny new toy if you're doing audit. And this is a very subjective, I've picked 4 logos, not entirely at random. I'm sorry if your favorite toy isn't on there. But my view of what are currently document-centric databases, and they've nailed message logging and auditing, because it's big, it is structured but loosely structured. You can't restate it. You can't actually do schema migration on this stuff. You do want self-describing documents of what went in over time. Yeah, you know what? Auditing really and message logging is fixed. And we've got, certainly as a percent of the company, I've got really nothing unique to offer here. We've made a god-awful job of this. It's in development and in research for us at the moment to do it better, and these are kind of the areas we're looking at. Forensics is more interesting. Now, forensics, I used this slide in April because I talked to our compliance people about what I could and couldn't display. And I found the really easy way to get an answer there is actually just don't ask them. So forensic is the ability to, we talked about time travel this morning. If you have the event log, if you have the message log, you can possibly go back to last year and see what happened. And that's actually exactly what we need to do. Forensics is the ability to respond to our clients, to manage that ecosystem, to deal with the issue where the elephant comes in and bitches that the lion bit it, and explain why that happened and how it happened and why it was fair and why you should continue trading with us and why you shouldn't go to the regulator and complain. And we need to be able to step through every sequence in that event log in painful, glorious detail and play it forward, understand what happened. And this for us is the absolute Firehose. Because of the way we decompose instructions when we receive them, the numbers jump up from about 10,000 inputs a second to typically 150,000 messages. And these are almost like paint instructions. You know, add liquidity here, remove liquidity there, trade happened here, order got cancelled there. And they are fully documented with everything about them in terms of the customer they came from, the time they arrived on, the instrument that was being traded. And to me, the closest I've seen to this is video, although I'm hideously out of date. I wouldn't claim to be an expert here. I did a weird project doing video transmission from satellites, believe it or not, about 20 years ago. And it was all about sort of iframes, so snapshots and deltas. And this is what we have here. It's sort of time series meets video, being able to go back to a number of reference frames and play forward from any of those frames. So I can basically rewind history. This is incredibly important stuff to us. If we lose this data, if this is not reliable, if this is not resilient, we actually have to stop trading. If this part of the system goes down, we shut business because actually we're then running an unregulated market. We can't say that the markets are orderly if we can't observe them and investigate. And on the back of this Firehose, we've got, sort of moving into kind of some of the CEP stuff we talked about earlier today, we've got analyses either ad hoc or constantly running. So I have a number of fraud detection patterns that are running against this Firehose of data, looking for certain events and using some of the windowing techniques we were talking about, or Dr. Andy Piper was talking about earlier in the day. Looking for interesting little patterns in the market that suggests someone isn't playing quite fairly and is maybe trying to influence people into doing something that they can profit from. And these are all regulatory requirements. These are things in retrospect, we would choose to do because they're actually incredibly useful, but hand on heart, we started doing because we had to do it to get a license. And we started with a third-party product for this. That very rapidly became our major performance bottleneck. It was the one thing we couldn't tune up. And that isn't really I'm not trying to damn the product. It was just a case of it's a lot harder to tune someone else's software than your own. The one benefit of writing it yourself is you can fix everything yourself. I mean, the downside is you have to fix everything yourself, but at least you've got a chance. And the sort of thing we do is this. We produce analyses like this, and the bit I haven't been allowed to show is what I have at each one of those data points is a full breakdown of the market. So what you're seeing there in blue, that's a representation of all the buyers. It's a bit of a false depth chart. There aren't really prices all the way down. But in terms of the various visualizations of a market, this is actually the one that's most effective for people to view visually. The pink side are all the offers to sell. And where the black point in the middle is the gap between them, where actually no one is yet selling low enough to meet a buyer and the buyers haven't come high enough to meet a seller. And at each point on that chart, I can blow that up and look at the maybe 50 to 1,000 data points that are under there that tell me what individual orders are in there, what individual prices, who they came from, when they placed them, what kind of order it was. This burns through disk like nobody's business. We run about a terabyte a week to support this process. And this was the same event we were looking at earlier. This was NonFarm Payroll. If anyone's interested, that's when the announcement happens. And this is the sort of picture of events we get going into that announcement. The little blocks are trades. So this is, again, us dealing with the kind of ramp up. So you can see running into there, reds are sells, blues are buys, and the shape is a rough indicator of the size of that trade. So we've got kind of steady trading running in. And then at, 13:29:30, so 30 seconds before the announcement, the market starts to wobble. People start getting interested. They start pitching one way or the other, basically betting on which way the market will move in response to the announcement, and then we get that market spike, and you can see the very intense cluster of trading over all of that. And we need to be able to explain to a customer why their order matched at a certain price during these events. And this is what we use to do it. Now, when we decided to replace the third-party product, we really, really tried hard not to write everything ourselves. The time series data I showed you earlier, we saw that in LevelDB. That works for us. That's fine. You know, as a product, we're very happy with that. Little bit of pain on cleanup. Gets horribly full of old keys. It's not very efficient for deleting things. But other than that, works perfectly. So that's what we tried first. LevelDB has, if anyone's worked with it, it basically uses the same model as Big Table underneath, and it has the same compaction problem. You get stalls. Writing 150,000 events a second, even if you've got, say, double the headroom, so you can process 300,000 events a second, a stall will kill you very, very quickly. It's like Ben was saying yesterday, if you wait for someone to react, if you wait a second, you're already dead. We have very, very little headroom for stalls in this system. We have some ability to buffer messages going in, but at that rate, it's limited. And the first prototype we wrote with LevelDB, we could cope with about 350K. We could not get around the compaction stalls. Just didn't work for us. React did a port of LevelDB, and I should state these numbers are about a year old. Almost exactly a year old. We were building these prototypes. So apologies to the products. These are probably not fair representations. Do your own tests. The React port was a major improvement on the standard LevelDB that dealt with a lot of the compaction problems. We could get up to about 700,000 to 1.5 million, and this was a view of the instability of the testing. We could not get reliable throughput. We could get occasional great runs and others that were less great. And it was kind of at this point that we looked at do we build our own again and have more internal inventory that only we can maintain? And what's the advantage in doing that? Well, the advantage in doing that is actually we build just what we need. Only the stuff we need, no extraneous features, nothing unnecessary. That's part of the bonus of building your own. The other is actually you know more about the data than any third-party product. The LevelDB key value store, it is generic. It understands keys and values. We know that our data is effectively time-sequenced. It's a time series. I have monotonically increasing transaction IDs. I can exploit that knowledge when I'm building my own solution, which is why using our own build, actually we can trounce that. And that's why we built our own product. It wasn't a piece of technical vanity. It was the fact that if we build that, the problem's just gone away. We took this off the table as something we have to worry about for our growth and scalability for probably a good 3 to 4 years. Excuse me. And the implementation there, everyone's interested, this was all just Java memory map files. This is what you can do when actually you're willing to write your own storage engine. And it's not actually that difficult. This was 2 guys for 3 months. We've got used to these patterns. They're not that hard to do. You don't have to run out and buy the next greatest database to solve all your problems. Some of this stuff can be built quite effectively at home. And it is really just indexed memory map files. Being able to deal with those. We still have the problem with the way the operating system file buffer cache interacts with memory mapping files. We do have stalls on here, but small enough to ride over them. And that kind of rounded out the picture of this, by the way, well beyond the guy would have left the interview by now, walked down the street. Man, it's mad. I thought we were finished on data when I'd kind of looked at, we've got the difficult stuff, we've got the regular stuff, we've got the transactional pieces. And it occurred to me that actually there's a whole class of problem that this doesn't deal with yet. Which is that most of our data isn't even our data anymore. And this is something we've only just touched on recently. In a trading system particularly, the number, again we were seeing this earlier, the number on someone else's screen is the one that's important to them. I think I said earlier, it's for our customers, better never than late. How do I know if it's late? Getting diagnostics off your customer's own platform is notoriously difficult if you didn't write that platform, and generally we don't. Our handoff is at the gateway servers. It's when we start sending the message down to the client. I don't know what they're seeing. I don't know what price the customer clicked on when they made a trade. I can be damn sure they'll complain about it if they think it was wrong, but I've actually no monitoring, no measurement of the state on the client side. I can't deal with that. And a vast amount of our data is actually, it's out there, it's on the network, it's queued in a router somewhere. Now, if you wait for the point where actually you can start getting network congestion as your signal of back pressure, that's what we started with, but it's really too late. If we only start dealing with the fact that our data that's out there is stale because we're starting to see the customer, we're actually receiving TCP back pressure. I cannot send a new message to that customer. It's a little bit like take a bottle of wine and try to empty it effectively by just turning it upside down. Take the cork out first, otherwise this experiment is not going to work at all. But turn it upside down, what you get is actually the first wine or data is very current, very fresh, and coming at the floor very fast. And then it pauses. And you get a complete stop. And then you get another glug, and you get another little burst of high-fidelity data, some of which has been queued for a while, the rest of which is real, and then there's another pause. And this is the experience you'll get trying to stream data to a client if you actually wait for the network to tell you there's a problem. You're just basically waiting for air pressure to stop the wine coming out. It's too late by then. The customer's experience is already screwed. They're seeing prices that are out of date. If they've got a decent trading client, it's telling them data's stale. If they've got a bad trading client, it's just giving them old prices and letting them decide what to do. It's really too late by that point. So we need to actually have our system aware of what is going on the network before the network tells us. And there are ways and means of doing that. You can start looking at the TCP window size to identify whether your customer is actually starting to enter the anxiety level before the network actually folds up on them completely. The other thing you can do is actually compliance test customers. And one of the things we do now is actually put customers through a fairly rigorous testing before we set the level of data they can receive, where it's kind of like, I haven't built this, I'd like to have one of the yacht throttles, just where you have it on the desk for testing and just ramp the volume up and see what they can cope with. Because most customers, financial trading, it attracts a certain personality type, shall I say. Tend to be a little aggressive, a little bullish, a little maybe overconfident about what they can do, and pretty much every initial customer engagement you get is, wow, I can have unlimited data, I'll have that, I'll have all of it, I'll have all of it now. And we go to it always feels like that kind of scene at the end of A Few Good Men, I want the truth and you can't handle the truth, and they never believe us. But they can't most of the time. There are very few clients who can actually manage our data unthrottled. Hell, we can barely manage it unthrottled. So actually going through a testing phase to work out what the client can do before you let them on is something that's become incredibly important to us and baked in. And I really wish I'd known that when we started, because this was my point about asking the questions the wrong way around. The hardest problems for us haven't been building a trading system that can trade at 100 microseconds. Sorry, with a latency of 100 microseconds, or do a few million transactions a second. We had that working in prototype in the first few weeks. The problems have actually been monitoring and measuring and understanding what the damn thing is doing, not just making sure it does it in the first place. So what do I think we've learned, or we as a business, and maybe hopefully some of us in the room? If you're still if you catch yourself, answering the question or asking the question, where's my data? This is my pitch for a soundbite for the conference. The database is everywhere now. Thinking of, again, your different business scenarios may vary, but for us, thinking of our data as, well, the only true copy is in our database, and the rest of it is just cache or ephemeral or transient, is, at worst, at best, that's lazy. At worst, it's delusional and possibly damaging. It depends on your business. The idea that data is in the database, that's possibly where you put it to bed at night. It's generally out there. It's interacting with your customers. It's in their systems, telling them to do things, forcing decisions. And to some degree or other, you have to be aware of that. The instrumentation data, it's, again, Ben said this yesterday, was that Netflix is a performance measurement company that sometimes ships videos. Yeah, I mean, we joke about ourselves as, yeah, we're a market data company that do the odd bit of trading, and I can kind of, track these jokes back to the sort of the McDonald's being basically a retail company that sells burgers to, get its tenants to pay the rent. It's time we stop being surprised about this stuff. This is the biggest event. I mean, if you look at the amount of social media there is at the moment as an analog to this, the world is not that much busier. More stuff is not happening. Social media, to me, is a measurement of how much crap we can develop around the stuff that was already happening anyway. And instrumentation is similar. For a given event that happens once, one transaction, there are probably 100 to 1,000 data points that tell me that are metadata for that transaction. Stuff about the stuff, not just the stuff itself. So it really shouldn't be a surprise that instrumentation is so big. And yet, why do we constantly, as technology people, leap at the kind of interesting, sexy challenge of how do I make a really fast trading engine? How do I do matching in microseconds? Really, the question I should be asking first is, how the hell do I measure it? Because if I don't know how to measure it, this is sort of macro level TDD. And if I can't test it's doing what I think it's doing, then how do I know it's doing it? And finally, if I'm dealing with this, with this wash of data, I've got to stop, pretending that I can understand it, in a detailed transactional, individual way. There is no way of visualizing more data points than you can plot on a screen if that's your tool. I need ways of dealing with, of representing more data than I can deal with point by point. I need better aggregations than means. And I'm really sorry if you hated statistics, you may have to take those classes again, because actually understanding how to describe something in a condensed pattern, I think is a massive part of our future if we're going to manage these systems that we're foisting on our customers these days. And with that point, thank you very much. Hand you over to the questions and.